Mixing with Mike, mixing tip, creating signal flow flexibility. I'm going to take a quick look at a session here and show you a few things. This is more of a conceptual design for organizing your tracks and laying out your session. And it's a system that I call the three-tier mix structure. And many people have different designs and ways that they do things. Like, for example, if you have multiple kick drum tracks here, like so you can see here, we have multiple kick drum tracks or different parts of a kick that blend together. And what I have them done is fed through bus into an aux channel. And this allows me to kind of process them all in the same chain. And this is not in this particular instance, because it's an electronic setup, there's no issues in terms of phase or phase relationship with the rest of a drum kit, an acoustic drum kit. The reason for this in Pro Tools, there is a small amount of latency when you run through an auxiliary channel. But this gives me the flexibility to go back and adjust the different elements that work here within this. So this is what we're dealing with, is sort of grouping and subgrouping and how you organize tracks. So what you'll see in this in this particular mix, and I'll show you this session here, is that I have a master channel here, and this would be the third tier of the three-tier mix structure. We have stems, which are in the darker blue here, and these stems actually are the second phase of the three-tier structure. So what we have is a mix. We have a separate stem for the bass. This is a house mix, so I wanted to separate or isolate that out. And we have a drum and percussion stem, a key stem, an effect stem. This is not like reverb effects. These are actual sound effects that are, so I've isolated them, put them separately, and then I have vocals. Okay, and pretty much it's not like a vocal background vocal. They're just some lead vocals, 3 of them, and then they just sort of blend together. So if I had background vocals and that was a key part, I would isolate those out. I try to keep the stems more to a minimum. So depending upon the type of track and music and all that sort of stuff, like for a classic rock thing, it might be only 3 stems or 4 stems if the background parts are a separate thing. Drums and percussion, guitars and bass with keys. Vocals, lead vocals would be 1 stem, background vocals would be another stem. Keep it really simple. And then I have individual tracks, and the individual tracks you'll see here are in the darker colors, and then the reverb returns are all in gray. So the color coding and organization here is important. The basic idea is that I have an individual track. So here are vocals, for example, all in red. They're processed, they're fed into effects, and then all those effects go into bus 9 and 10. This one is not being used at the time. It's not being assigned, so that's dead. That's why it's not a sound assigned to that bus. 9 and 10 then feeds into this vocal stem here. Now, if you watch the last mix tip from the previous week, then part of that was setting up a parallel on the stem for adding in a layer of density. And so you can watch that tip if you want to see that. So I've left that in here just because I left it in there. But the idea here of this is that what I get here with this is 3 stages of processing if I want, or even more. And I'm creating a flexibility that allows me to kind of do whatever I want. Other forms of flexibility that kind of come into working with the mix is setting up your reverb and delays and effect returns on separate auxiliary returns and using sends to feed into them. So why is this so much more powerful? And I'll show you as this kind of extends out why this is the best way to, or one like very flexible way of working here, is that I can process the dry signal and then have completely separate controls over the returns. And so if I put reverb on it, I have a reverb where I can set up and determine how much of it I want by setting up the send. I can adjust the return level. I can process the reverb or delay effects completely independent of the dry signal, because once I've put that into the chain, then any processing that occurs after that is going to affect both the reverb or the effect and the dry signal. So this gives me, ultimate control. And now, by putting all of these with the reverb and effects into the stem here, when I go to print out stems, like if I want to send this off to a remixer or something like that, it's very easy for me to mute out the effects, give them a dry stem, leave the effects in, give them a stereo stem of vocals with effects. And it's just as simple as muting tracks. So I have like a group here for the mute, but I could just mute this and then feed them a bass and percussion mix and just bounce it out that way. It makes it very, very easy for me to just kind of lay things out. So why go through all this trouble? Because it seems like a lot of trouble, but actually the signal flow is incredibly simple. And one of the things that I found in mixing and doing any kind of tracking sessions. And this is something I learned very early on, is that when I was assisting in studios and I was watching these master mix engineers and tracking engineers really do their thing, I noticed that they always kept things very simple. And of course, and I was amazed at the quality of the sound that they got. But when I started tracking, I wanted to do I had all these ideas that I wanted to try out in ways of tracking and complicated setups and doing these things so that it would be really cool. And the only problem when you set up and make things very complicated is that when the producer or the artist says, "Oh, can you try this?" all of a sudden you're completely frozen because you've painted yourself into a corner where you can only work in one particular way because you've made your setup so sort of narrow and focused in one direction. Now, if you have complete control over everything and you're not dealing with any kind of input from anybody else, you can maintain that. But whenever you want to extend or pull yourself out of that structure, you can't. So how does that extend here? Because this seems like there's a lot of signal flow complexity here, but actually it's very simple. I have dry tracks. I have the reverb tracks on separate returns, so I have complete control over the effects, the balances of them, the feeds into them, the processing of the individual delays. I can take the outputs of delays, feed them into reverbs, take the output of reverbs, feed them into delays, vice versa. So I have all the flexibility to cross-feed, center feed, move things, cross them, run them into parallel processing chains, whatever I want to do, very quick and easy. I keep them all organized together. I color code everything, so it's very simple to see. And then the whole thing returns up on one return. And that way it gives me, like, now if I want to work on drums, I can just go over here quickly, mute the keys and other parts, just work on the drums, right? It keeps it very simple. And if I hear some other return happening, I know I forgot to assign something else. So here I have the bass that's feeding into 1 and 2. I have one single effect track that's there. All my drums and percussion, I try to keep somewhat similar color ranges. So all the drums and percussion kind of going out here in different colors with all of their effects, all feeding into bus 3 and 4. Guitars and keyboards and all of those types of stuff, and pads all feeding into 5 and 6. Again, this return I'm not using for anything, so I can kind of pull that down, take that out. The effects channels, right? So these are all the different effects and sounds, and then those also feeding into buses, and all of that is stemmed together. So in terms of a flexibility standpoint, I have the ability to process on individual channels, process all the effects independently, compress them, do whatever I want independently. I can feed them over into my chain here, and then I can apply processing on my stems. So I can save that for later. I can do that at any point. And then I can also process the whole mix in the third chain. So it gives me 3 levels, and it also gives me very quick and easy, if you watch the last tip, of running in the parallel chain, where I can have a parallel processing chain to kind of give me a consistent kind of hype or density to the overall mix. Very quick, very easy to set up. And if somebody says, "Hey, I want to do this," it's like, oh, no problem. Mute something out, open up another track, add an aux channel, whatever it is, very simple. But if I paint myself into a box by running like all my vocals into one aux channel, and then I'm putting my reverbs and effects on that aux channel, and then, when somebody wants to pull out one effect or feed one thing into something else, it becomes like a big mess. And this makes it really simple, this kind of workflow. So I've seen videos and I've watched other things that, or really not even so much that, but have heard from other people, watched my private students and some of the things that they bring in, some of the ideas that they bring in. And there are some really interesting concepts and really cool ways of working. And I think you should always explore and investigate those ideas. But in terms of the flexibility and the ability to change directions very quickly and make adjustments, I don't think I've found a system or a way of working for myself that offers that much in terms of the way it's set up. And so I really get against this idea of kind of painting myself into a corner. I always want to leave myself the flexibility to expand my workflow and signal flow at any point that the client says, "Hey, can we do this instead?" No problem. Mute a couple channels, open something else up. What do you think of this? Oh, that's cool. Let's try this too. And then you add that on, move on, and you could just kind of add it in, and you're not trying to deconstruct a workflow that seems simpler but leaves less flexibility. All right. Anyway, that's mixing with Mike mix tip of the week, and it's creating signal flow flexibility.